Welcome, everybody. So we are the Human Rights Protocol Considerations Research Group. Come on in, grab a seat, make sure you scan the blue sheets. You'll need to have the mobile client or the full client open to be able to get into the queue to use the mic, so make sure that you scan the blue sheets. Great, let's go ahead and get started. It's 5 o'clock, so you know what that means. It's time for human rights. So we are the Human Rights Protocol Considerations Research Group. Again, just to remind you, this session gets recorded. It's important to record your participation, and you do that by QR coding into the room or joining virtually. And this will be posted on YouTube, so just take note of that when you come to the mic and speak. It's always really great if you can introduce yourself for the notes, for the folks listening in online. And furthermore, regarding notes, could I get a volunteer to take notes for this session? You don't have to record the talks. We would like you to take minutes on any discussion after the talks or during the AOB. Is there somebody who'd be willing to do that? There's a note-taking device that's really handy inside the client for the meeting. Still don't have a note taker. We could also take a volunteer from online. Anyone willing to do that? You could just raise your hand if you'd be willing to take notes for the session. I heard a yes. Cool. Okay. I will take the yes, even though I don't know exactly what it is. But thank you. I really, really, really appreciate it, as I'm flying solo here for the first hour. And last reminder, and then I will introduce myself and who I am. So the Meet Echo queue, you do need to also sign the blue sheets to be able to get in the queue later. So I'm Mallory Nodal, and I'm one of the co-chairs of the Human Rights Protocol Considerations Research Group. Sophia Selly is my co-chair, and she's going to be here in about an hour's time. This is Monday, so you might not have seen this, and new joiners from participating virtually might never have seen this before. It's the Note Well. It's also on intellectual property, just like in the IETF, the IRTF also follows this policy. So any sort of intellectual property rights that you know of, even if you don't even hold them, you need to disclose those. And you can read more about the policies online, but this is just a brief reminder. I've already reminded you about both the audio and video recordings, but that's important, especially if you care about your privacy or you care about looking up and following this information later and who was here and who's speaking. Though we do have a privacy and code of conduct. I want to dwell on the code of conduct as just for a moment. We have an ombuds team in place at the IETF and the IRTF. We do expect everybody to be respectful of one another, and you can find out more if you have any concerns. That's it for the preambular stuff. The IRTF, so HRPC is under the IRTF. We are conducting research on the interplay between human rights and protocols. And so we're looking at the long-term effects in both directions of those things. It's been a home for discussions, not just specific to internet protocols that get standardized here. We've also had some really excellent talks from other parts of the standards ecosystem, such as IEEE, W3C, and so on. So if you, or ITU, for example, if you cross those standards bodies, we're also the place for you. We were chartered to look at protocols that strengthen and threaten human rights. And we used to have a slide that gave us a timeline of this. Is it the next one? Yeah, okay, great. So way back in 2014, 2015, this was proposed as a research group. It took some time, but we were finally chartered then about 18 months later in December 2015. And we have 2 RFCs. The first is a real wide scoping document that talks about what research on human rights and protocol considerations would look like in the sort of largest expression of that. And then more recently, just last year, we published a companion document to that, which is more helpful if you're actually a protocol designer or someone who writes specification documents for how to consider human rights in protocol and architecture designs. We've had dozens of meetings, even more speakers. If you do the math on roughly 3 speakers per session, we've had loads of really, really interesting talks. We've had lots of really good ideas come around. So we're really happy today to be able to invite 3 more excellent talks to that. You can find all of I've actually put in a playlist at some point, all of the HRPC sessions that I mentioned, all 31 of them. You can watch them on YouTube. It's many, many hours of human rights and protocol goodness. Right now, I would just give folks an update. This is out of date, so the guidelines document at the bottom is done. We still have a couple things that are open. They're not really finished. They might get picked up again. There's a freedom of association on the internet draft that hasn't been revised since the last, I think, IETF chair review. If folks ever want to pick that up, if you're well versed in civic space and association, that would be a good one to round out. And then another one on intimate partner violence considerations. That is still in play, even though in the data tracker it looks expired. We will give an update on that document at the end. And just to say, these are all the folks at the top of the slide who've been involved over the years. Right now, Sophia and I are the current co-chairs, but Avri Doria and Niels ten Uver were also previous chairs. And then we have a couple of technical advisors, one of which for sure is active, Daniel Kahn-Gilmore, and then Nick Doty was and probably could continue to be the doc shepherd for Draft Association. So thank you for putting that in the chat, Nick, very well timed. All right, let's see if, sorry. That must be the end of the slides. So apologies for missing the agenda. Oh, that's right. It was at the beginning. That's the issue. Court's indulgence. Right. So we have 3 talks. We are really excited to bring in Maria Farrell to talk about rewilding the internet. Folks read the Noema article. It's really great. There's also then Ineta, who is coming in to talk about Ineta.net. Someone from Ineta.net is coming in to talk about the 2025 internet shutdown in Iran. And then we'll have as well Chantal Joris from Article 19 that will also be presenting a talk. We'll have a little bit of time at the end to talk about an update on the IPV document and AOB. There's at least one item. If you have AOB and you can send me a quick message on the platform, I will make sure that we don't run out of time for your thing. So with that, Maria, I'd love to invite you in off to get on video and to get on mic, and I will switch the deck and pass it to you.
Super. Hi, everyone. My name is Maria Farrell. Is the sound okay? You can hear me? Yep. Oh,
Sound
super.
Great. Yeah.
Thank you very much. So I am speaking to you from Kerry in the southwest of Ireland, where I am. I'm going to talk to you about an article that I co-wrote with Robin Bergeon, who is also a public interest technologist. It came out in an American magazine about a year ago. It's 8,000 words long, and but it's quite readable, I think. And it's basically it was called "We Need to Rewild the Internet." And the headline version of this is that the internet, through the entire technical stack, throughout the infrastructure, all the way from the application layer, through the protocol layer, through the connectivity layers, and certainly in the business models that you deliver it, and in the digital advertising models that surround it, is extremely concentrated and consolidated. And although the tech bros, CEOs who own much of it and plan to go on owning it, call it an ecosystem, it's probably much more accurate to say that it resembles a highly concentrated agricultural plantation. So that's the headline. And so what I'm going to do in this talk is just bring you through some of the main insights that Robin and I kind of came up with to look at what do we do to heal broken habitats while we rewild them. I'll tell you a bit more about that. And also I will just drill down a little bit more than I usually do into some of the I think I'm going to reference some of the concentration and consolidation discussion that has already taken place here at the IETF. And I know, in fact, that running exactly at the same time as this session is the group that looks at concentration and consolidation. So I'm glad you've come to the human rights session. And I also encourage you at some point in the future to take stock of the discussions that are happening adjacent to this. So I always start talking about rewilding the internet by going back to a story about Prussian scientific forestry of the 17th century. So roll up a chair and prepare for story time. So back in the 17th century, so this would be the 1600s, Prussia, which was the biggest, most powerful and wealthy state of what ultimately became modern day Germany, they had a lot of forestry, and it was a time when Europe was undergoing a shortage of timber. And timber at the time was what we used to build ships, build houses, build bridges, build pretty much everything that you need as a modern society. And everybody was building so fast that they were running out of trees. So in Prussia, somebody came up with the idea of looking at the mixed growth, deciduous, different kinds of variety of trees that they had in their forests, and thought, well, can we simplify this and make this easier and cheaper and better to run? And they also looked at the people who were the skilled and knowledgeable local foresters, the people who were in charge of maintaining the forestry and knowing at a very, very deep fundamental level, like almost like programmers today, I would say, who really understand what made this forest system work as a system, and thought, well, can we get rid of them? I mean, can we have fewer people and fewer skilled people? And then they also looked at the common ownership of a lot of the forestry. So a lot of the peasants, the just normal day-to-day people, while they didn't own the forest, they had rights to go into them to graze their pigs, to plant, to collect flowers and things like they use for medicine and for making dyes for clothes. And basically they had rights of access. And so the moneyed and property classes decided, let's get rid of that common ownership, let's enclose these forests, let's make them monocultures because they will be easier to manage. And because they're easier to manage, we won't have a whole class of skilled foresters who we need to pay money to and who we are worried about knowing more about our forests than we know ourselves. So they did that. They basically clear felled the forests and planted trees, all the same species, in perfectly straight lines. And they sat back and waited for 70 years. 70 years came and went, and they harvested the forest, and they made so much money that it actually changed the course of European history. They spent all of that money on dresses, on ball gowns, on buying military commissions for their eldest sons, on fighting very, very expensive wars, on financing extractive and colonialist and imperialist voyages abroad. And they just thought, this has been so fantastic. We're going to basically start again. The forests have been clear felled. We're going to go and just press play again. This has been such a brilliant plan, and it is all to do with our genius as the people with the most money and the most control. And so we must keep being geniuses and keeping even more wealthy than we presently are. So they did that. They planted all the same species again. And the next time round, the forest started to look a bit like this. In fact, the forests were so weak, the trees were dying, they were being pushed over in storms, dying of diseases and insects, blight, that the Germans, who love a good compound word, invented a new word to describe what they were seeing around them. And that word is Waldsterben, or forest death, because they had literally killed their own forests. So what they had actually done was reinvented something, a kind of an extractive form of production that we think of as the plantation. And the plantation is, of course, a single, usually a single crop, very intensively cultivated, extraction-only operation. So it's a good way to grow tea, it's a good way to grow rubber or maize, But one thing it is not, it's a good thing for growing commodity crops, but it's not a habitat. It's not a healthy place to live. And so every single closed, extractive, proprietary set of technology products that I think the internet consolidation and concentration is leaning towards, it also calls itself an ecosystem when in fact it is clearly more of a plantation. And so to, sorry, just move forward my slide here. To bring in another metaphor, if I may, one of the another metaphor to understand how much like a plantation today's internet is, which is owned by such a tiny number of companies, which is run effectively by a single business model, which is advertising-based surveillance, is the internet of today. We need another metaphor for it, and that metaphor that I think of is a windowless skyscraper. A huge tall building that looks a bit like something from The Lord of the Rings or the Eye of Sauron, where it is owned and controlled from top to bottom by the same person or the same company. And another thing about skyscrapers, which is, I think, useful for us to think about, is that when you're inside a skyscraper, you can see very, very far around you, but you cannot see the building that you are in. In fact, that's pretty much the only thing you can't see. And in some respects, many of us, and especially those of us in their 20s and 30s, have grown up in an internet that effectively is a series of skyscrapers, of centralized, hierarchically controlled, top-down, extractive business models with very proprietary and closed technology models. And it's kind of hard to see because you've always grown up inside it. But this is actually not the only way to internet. And I'm like a bunch of other people, I think I sometimes use the word internet as a verb. And of course, having a skyscraper internet is a problem at the best of times and at the worst of times when those skyscrapers are owned by a tiny number of individuals, and those individuals are clearly of an incredibly powerful country, which is increasingly lawless and is becoming something akin to a fascist regime. You can see the absolute risk factor of there being only 2 or 3 different companies who run effectively the internet all the way from the application layer, from the top of the stack, all the way down to the bottom. And so those are the clear failure modes that we have with the present day internet. And I think where this is really relevant to this group is that in terms of human rights vulnerabilities, when you have just a couple of guys who are running the internet, obviously when their politics are what they are, the lack of a decentralized internet means most people, be they activists, be they citizens, be they teachers, be they journalists, have fewer places to go, fewer services to use, and are vastly more vulnerable to surveillance, to censorship, and also to the use of the collection and use of their data and use against them in ways that are harmful to them individually and also that are harmful to our politics collectively. And we have seen that many of the people who are running the present day internet are on record as being actively antagonistic to democratic governance. So to come back to even come a bit further out in the wider focus, the English parliamentarian Tony Benn used to ask several questions of power, his 5 questions of power. And those questions are a question you would ask of any powerful people, and I would ask it of a CEO of a huge planetary technology firm, is what power do you have? Where did you get it? In whose interest do you use that power? To whom are you accountable? And most importantly of all, how do we get rid of you? And Tony Benn used to say that anyone who cannot answer the last of those questions does not live in a democratic system. And of course, I think, thinking back to the previous slide, in terms of the ownership of these models and our ability to change, let's say, the algorithm of Twitter or to the algorithm of Instagram, we have zero power and no way to depose and no way to hold them accountable. I think just as Tony Benn had his 5 questions of power, I also want to just bring in some principles of what the internet is that were developed about 10 years ago and by an internet engineer called Leslie Daigle. And Leslie, who's been extremely active in the IETF and technical community for many years and is of course a deeply respected person, she came up with something called the internet invariance. So something that does not vary. And these are the sort of the principles or the observations about the internet from its design at the very, very beginning to that kind of go through it and determine or define what the internet is. And I'll just summarize them very briefly. And I'll circulate a version of these slides that have these notes on them, Mallory. But the internet invariants are, number one, global reach and integrity. So any endpoint on the internet can address any other endpoint. General purpose. The internet was not built for any single application, but it's capable of supporting a wide range of demands for its use. It doesn't define what can be done now or in the future. Innovation without requiring permission. So permissionless innovation, which you may even have heard of. You know, we can use the internet to connect to existing services, but you also don't have to ask anybody. You know, if you plug in TCP/IP on a server, you don't have to ask permission to connect to the internet, and that is fundamental. Accessibility. Anyone who uses the internet can consume and contribute content, put up a server, put up a website, attach new networks. And then also, just to finish up on this side of things, the internet requires the following basic agreements and patterns of behavior for it to function in a healthy and diverse, techno-diverse way. And they will be interoperability and mutual agreement. So rather than this top-down control of the lords who sacked all of the foresters, the internet is defined, it's a context for interoperation using open standards. Collaboration, it works on a spirit of collaboration rather than a spirit of top-down control. And the technology is reusable building blocks, which is in a way what everyone is at the IETF to develop is protocols, which are the lifeblood, the DNA of the internet's interoperability. And finally, and this is back to Tony Benn, no permanent favorites. Nobody gets to be on top of the internet. Nobody gets to be the king of the internet. You just don't get to buy it and own it and say, throw away the keys and say, that's it, sorry, I own the internet now, and you can never develop it anymore. And you can't develop protocols except that serve my business model. So sorry that quick little roundup of what makes the internet the internet. I really, really encourage you to read a paper that Leslie wrote 10 years ago now, and is just as true today, when she came up with the phrase climate change for the internet. And she really drew down on the urgency and the structural change that was happening to concentrate and consolidate internet ownership and control into the hands of a tiny number of companies. And of course, those trends have only intensified since then. And this is a paper that she wrote at the time. Also, the Internet Society did quite a bit of work on it. Just this slide says it's not the economy, stupid. What am I trying to get at here? We're always told, and I've heard this from many people involved in the IETF, that the internet is consolidating and concentrating. Maybe they sort of disagree that it is, but if it is, it's just because of economic forces. It's just because of economies of scale. And I really push back on that very, very strongly, because although, of course, we are, up against some vast economies of scale, some structural economic forces, we all are still nonetheless able to make choices in our lives about who we work for, what we do, what kind of business models we uphold. And I think in the IETF, particularly over the last 5 or 6 years, we've seen a lot of an activity called protocol washing. Basically, large firms who are able to effectively develop their own technical protocol in-house and then bring it to, and it supports their business model, bring it to the IETF to get a rubber stamp. This is now an IETF protocol, which has a whole other set of, respect and a whole other status, and say, well, now this is an IETF protocol. And the IETF, well, it's got many people who are working extremely hard, especially in this group, to pull in the other direction, has also been a key part of the infrastructure that is leading to concentration and consolidation of the internet. So, and I just always, when internet engineers throw up their hands and say, well, it's not our fault, this is just the economy, there's nothing we can do about that, I kind of always come back and say, economic rules are not like the laws of physics. This is not gravity we're talking about. These are sets of choices we make, and I think we can make different ones. So this is where rewilding the internet comes in. And rewilding the internet is basically a kind of asking us as technologists to just have a little humility and curiosity and look beyond ourselves for once and ask ourselves, well, the internet is effectively, if it is a habitat, and if it is an extremely unhealthy monocultural habitat that is, very, very badly damaged, well, can we look to other fields of human endeavor to find how do we help habitats to repair themselves? And it turns out that in ecology, ecologists and biologists have been working for decades on how to regenerate broken and damaged habitats. And so there's a whole just world of human knowledge and endeavor out there that is able to, I'm going to advance the slides here, that is able to, you see in this slide, you've got the monocrop forestry on one side, and then you've got a mixed forestry on the other, which is full of species, full of wildlife, full of diversity. And there's a whole slew of people who work hard every day and night, who do real science all the time on how to make what's on the left of this picture look a bit more like what's on the right. And so I think we in technology, and especially in internet technology, can learn an awful lot from them on how do we kind of escape from an internet that is centralized and has got all of the human rights risks, vulnerabilities, and frankly, tramplings that we do see in the current internet, and give people an alternative to what's currently on offer. So there was one thing that the Prussian scientific forestry people did not know about why their forests all died. And it was because when you take away all of the different kinds of species that are working together in a mixed and complex system, you take away something that they weren't aware of. And that was that underneath each forest, there is a biological mass of life that is even bigger than the forest itself. And that is the fungal networks, what we call mycelial networks of tiny fungi with little, almost tiny strings that go around all of the roots of all of the trees, and that themselves carry sugar, carry information, carry water, and that forests and that specific trees in forests use as an alternative network to their root network to pass nutrients and information around. And when the underneath of the forest, when the mycelial network is healthy, the forest above is healthy. And so when the Prussians had cut down all of their trees, and the trees that were from different species and different plants, shrubs, bushes, flowers, grasses, different spaces, sometimes you have concentrated forests, and then sometimes you have meadows. When they got rid of all of that, they killed the mycelial network beneath. And so you did not have the shadow network, which was actually doing the real work of the network. And sometimes when I'm thinking about this, I often think about the people who are building and maintaining the internet every day are themselves the shadow network. And so I think that's why it's so important that meetings like the IETF come and bring people together, both online and in person, to build those networks of trust and networks of exchange, where we kind of can exchange and develop ideas of different ways of doing things. So ecology knows a bunch of stuff that we can use as technologists. The first thing that it knows is that diversity is resilience. So having different ways to get that packet around the internet, having different routing structures, having different service providers, having different business models for all of the service providers, and having different software, even to some extent different protocols, that gives us resilience that we would not otherwise have. So if you remember, the forests that have all the same kind of trees, once a storm comes, it blows them all down. And we know, in natural disasters and human disasters and in war, you need to have different kinds of technological diversity so that you have resilience when the network comes down. And I'm sure the next speaker who talks about internet shutdowns, specifically in Iran, will have some things to say about that. The other thing that ecology knows is that complexity is good. And I think as engineers, many people are trained to think that you need to simplify systems, you need to centralize them, you need a system that is simple and very, very basic and has a clear set of controls, clear levers that you can pull, that it is not just a more effective system. There is almost, I think strongly that an aesthetic sense that is a more beautiful system. And in fact, what biology shows us is that complexity is both necessary for life and for resilience, and is also a good in and of itself. Complexity is beautiful. Complexity is good. We're not necessarily doing our jobs very well when we trample out and iron out all of the complexity in our networks. So, and decentralized networks, in all of the ways networks can be decentralized, are effectively nature's shock absorbers. They allow us to stand up to and find different ways to route around information. So, and as having a diverse and decentralized network all the way up and down the stack is one way to, as this poster in a conference I recently went to shows, it's a way to build an internet that they cannot turn off. The other thing that rewilding shows us is that you just need to make one little crack in the concrete and new stuff grows. And I think, already we are seeing this certainly I'm seeing it a lot at the social media layer. There is a vast amount of energy and excitement and impetus in building new social media protocols to allow different kinds of social media. And it's, in nature, and I'll just give you one or two quick little factoids, but rewilding teaches us that when we make space, diversity literally just pops up out of nowhere. I was reading about there's an enormous river system which was dammed in Alaska 60 or 70 years ago. The dam was finally pulled down 4 years ago, and within literally on the second day of the dam having been pulled down, salmon who had almost a century before traveled up that river to spawn, salmon were found within 48 hours swimming up that river to spawn, something that they had not been able to do for decades. And we found, in multiple different ways, just when you, for example, humpback whales were almost extinct in the wild in the 1980s. There were 5,000 of them left. We took measures to make a world where it was easier for them simply to survive. Didn't do anything, just make life a bit easier for them. Didn't put our fingers on the scales of trying to make humpbacks behave differently. Today, there are 135,000 humpback whales in the wild. So basically, the huge lesson of rewilding is, one, it's based on human and biological resistance and resilience, which is that when you make space for new things to grow, they grow back and quickly. One of the ways this is happening, and I've got mixed feelings about this, but is something that's called the Eurostack. This is, I would say, it's more a movement which is happening in Europe, but also Brazil, also Taiwan, where governments and people more broadly are looking to move away from concentrated and consolidated cloud offerings. And so you're seeing an explosion of different offerings, but particularly a massive growth in the conversation of what I'm going to call normies, non-technical people who really never thought about the fact that they only use Microsoft or that they only use Google Cloud before, and who are now, changing. The city of Lyon decided a couple of weeks ago to move away from Microsoft for all of its, word processing and all of that kind of cloud stuff. And we're seeing this. The digital ministry in Denmark again has made a similar move. And we're seeing moves all over the planet, really, of people who have looked at, that picture of Elon Musk and that picture of Donald Trump, or the picture of all of the US tech CEOs at the inauguration. And whatever your politics are, it's scary to see, commercial power and the coercive power of government come together like that. They've looked at that picture and said, this is a warning, and we're taking it. So, and, just getting towards wrapping up here, I think rewilding the internet calls on us to change our aesthetic, to change what we think of as beautiful and desirable. So on the left here, we see a picture in the Scottish Highlands of a place about 10 or 15 years ago. It was a grouse moor. Those little white dots are sheep, which we have a lot of here outside in the field outside of my house. Lovely, sweet creatures. They make delicious lamb cutlets. However, they are one of the most species that denudes landscapes and makes them monocultural and makes nothing else grow, because they will literally eat everything except the most invasive of plants. 15 years, you leave it, you take away the sheep, build a fence, and 15 years later, you've got this incredibly diverse, rich, and frankly, more beautiful landscape. And I think so many of us have been trained to find the bare and barren and all but dead landscape on the left beautiful, when the diverse, complex, different looking one on the right is actually equally, if not more beautiful. And I think we need to look at technology in a similar vein. We need to regenerate an internet that currently looks like this very simple tiled pattern into an internet that structurally and in all of our infrastructure looks more like a mosaic. And again, ecology teaches us that what is really, really healthy, if you're a honeybee, a wild honeybee that's flying around outside of my window right now, you don't want to live in a world where there's 100 acres of the same crop and it flowers for 2 weeks of the year, and there's so much food to eat you can't eat, and there's nothing to eat for the rest of the time. A diverse technological ecosystem is one where we have different business models, different providers, different kinds of ways to connect, all alongside each other. And I think the thing where the IETF and where protocols come in so importantly are, if you see this picture, it's a picture of a bunch of green fields like the kind that we have in Ireland. And what's actually doing all of the work of nature's diversity in this photograph is the lines that are between them. Those lines are of hedges of blackthorn and whitethorn and lots of different species where different plants live, different insects live, and also small little mammals live. And those connect the different fields. They're like nature's highway. And I think of protocols as like nature's highways. They are the bits that connect the different parts of the internet to each other and allow the different parts of the mosaic ecosystem to cohabit and not all have to be part of the same technical monoculture. And so sometimes we need to have not just hedgeways, we need to have, this is a nature's highway that has been built over an actual highway to connect two different habitats so that large mammals can go from one to the other because they need lots of room to graze and to grow. And sometimes you need to put a very heavy thumb on the scales. And so we also need, for internet rewilding, we need regulators, we need policymakers, we need not just us as technical people in the technical community, but we also need political action. And that comes by acting together collectively to change things. So this is a bee hotel, which is, it's a picture taken in County Clare in Ireland a few months ago. It just is really an image that I want to use to you to suggest that there are lots of different ways that we can live together on the internet. We don't all have to live in exactly the same kind of size and shape of offering, be it social media, be it the same telco provider, be it the same ISP, be it just one or two internet exchange points. We need to have that diversity and variety to allow us to live beside each other happily. And so to do that, I think as technologists, we need to think differently about scale. Scale is not the be all and the end all. It's not necessary for a lot of the things we're told are necessary. Biological laws are different from economic laws. And physical laws. Physical laws, like gravity, actually works. A lot of economic laws are more ideas that have come to currency. I think we need to think differently about perfection and simplicity. This is not what good networks look like. This is not what healthy networks look like. Think about if you're in Russia trying to get data in and out of the country, having to sync a tiny number of internet exchange points that are controlled centrally by Roskomnadzor is in a very perfect, simplified, hierarchical system. It's a great system if you want to commit human rights abuses. So I think we have to think differently about what perfection looks like and how it feels. And of course about money, about what we're willing to do for money and where we think the money should flow. And finally, to just leave you with the words of Hannah Arendt, who is a German philosopher a Jewish woman who grew up in Germany in the 20s and 30s and wrote about totalitarianism in the 50s and 60s, looking back on what she had lived through. She basically said to all of us, when we are dealing with these kinds of oppressive systems, especially those of us in more democratic countries, we do not have the right to obey. We don't have the right to just say, this is too hard and somebody else needs to fix it. I know you're probably all in this room because you probably feel something like that. I just think it puts it to, all of us have choices about what we do. And I think rewilding the internet, figuring out how you rewild the internet, I think is an incredible project for life, for the world, for all of us and for us collectively. And it's an incredibly joyous collective thing to do. And that is my talk on rewilding the internet.
Great. So we do have a couple minutes for questions, not many. We're cutting into AOB time, but I only have one AOB as far as I know, so we have a little bit. If folks want to queue or if you want to raise your hands online. There's also Maria's contact information there, so certainly you can reach out that way as well. Thanks so much, Maria. Really appreciate it. We'll see you online and in person. Thanks again. So going back to our agenda, I think next we have Shabnam. And so let me go ahead and swap the slides. So Shabnam, I will pass these to you in just a moment.
Great, thank you.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for joining. So yeah, take it away. Go right ahead.
All right. Good evening, everyone. And thank you for, at the end of your day, including Project INETA as part of the Human Rights Protocol considerations discussion. We wanted to present our observations of the most recent internet shutdown in Iran that just occurred last month in June 2025, and share the evolution of the government's capabilities of implementing full shutdowns from 2009 to the present day. Please keep in mind that there have been many, many partial shutdowns along the way. And what we want to sort of dig into is the evolution of being able to successfully implement a full internet shutdown. Our goal today is to basically share the incidences of these shutdowns and raise awareness of the level of sophistication authorities have gained over the past 16 years and the human rights implications that Iranians face every day in consequence. In case you want to have a little bit knowledge of who we are, Project INETA, we were established in 2011. Our basic mission is to advance online anonymity, security, and freedom in high-risk countries. And we do that through several different ways, but they all mainly focus on research and providing internet intelligence and engineering capacity, and developing and distributing circumvention and security tools. All right, let's focus on the rise of the National Information Network. So we're going to start referring to this as the NIN, as to sort of show you the shutdown evolution. So since 2009, Iranians tend to lose their capacity to access global internet services just when they need it the most. So think during protests when security forces violently crack down on demonstrators, and when they need to broadcast events to help their fellow citizens, as well as alert international media and human rights organizations. So over the years, citizens have seen their every move tracked by the government, and increasingly, they have also seen that their only options continually get narrowed to eventually only being able to use a government-friendly digital service. That is because Iran has been building a local intranet that makes government internet shutdowns easier and enables fine-tuning, control, and surveillance of online communications. And this is what we now know and have, which is called the National Information Network, or NIN. So the first time we saw the government attempt, or basically their methodology was to pull the plug, quite literally, of the internet, was in 2009, what we call the Green Movement. Basically, in short, elections were held on June 12th, and I don't know, very ironically, I guess, authorities announced just a couple hours after the polls closed that the incumbent president won by what they consider a landslide. Protesters did not trust this information, and they took to the streets. And for the first time, they were organizing, expanding, and documenting protests through social media. platforms. And this really took the government by surprise. And the government abruptly disconnected the internet haphazardly, and that basically created somewhat of a virtual Armageddon. Very simple things, like all communications were just broken up. Banks went offline, ATMs stopped distributing money, embassies could not communicate with each other, and government platforms just basically all stopped working. So when I list consequences in these different events, I'm basically sort of sharing what did the government learn or realize from their actions. And so in this context, the government realized that there was very detrimental effects of pulling the plug. So that wasn't a good methodology to move forward. And they increased monitoring on social media as a result. And then we also saw increased blocking and censorship. And then they decided to realign their national security to really focus on shifting towards internet governance and policies and laws. And then we saw several different ministries that started opening up to sort of focus in on that and policy making. And in the end, they realized that what they really wanted to do was prioritize developing a national information network. In 2012, we pretty much saw a similar reaction as a result of the government's response. So what was going on in 2012, that was the first election cycle since 2009. And there was a lot of domestic economic pressure and unrest due to rather new sanctions that were implemented. On February 7th of that year, the children of opposition leaders of 2009 elections, they were calling for peaceful protests on January 14th to observe the 1-year mark of house arrest of their parents. And in sort of a preemptive manner, the authorities implemented targeting, blocking, denying over 30 million users access to sites such as Facebook, Twitter, and Google, including Gmail. And when people would try to access any of these, they would just get a message that said, according to computer crime regulations, access to this website is denied. By February 13th, the government, they restored email, for example, but then it still flexed its censorship abilities by cherry picking what foreign external websites that they would like to allow in and what would remain blocked. So from this, the government was really convinced that they should continue sort of full force developing the national information network. And they even established the Supreme Council of Cyberspace. And then the cracking down on the public really instilled like a basic fear of what is to come if this national information network was really to come into fruition. They would be losing a lot of external internet sources and communication methods as well. This is actually a map of what they envisioned the NIN network should look like and how it should work. The basic idea was to build new data centers and infrastructure domestically and creating an internal internet exchange, particularly focused at first in larger cities. In theory, the government offered incentives and sort of marketed the NIN to companies and organizations to encourage them to bring their businesses and their infrastructure in country. I say incentives, but really it was like a massive push. The government was saying that they would give you free access to data centers and capacity and things like that for businesses and individuals. But if you didn't accept this, then during a time of a shutdown, or if they decided to block you, then you just simply would not be able to operate at all. So that would obviously very much hurt businesses. This slide, I find it to be a very interesting, almost inflection point of what and how they decided to implement shutdowns. So during 2019, the country's economy had been really choked by crippling sanctions that were reimposed by the United States in 2018. And by 2019 in April, there were further threats of imposing sanctions on any country that continued to buy oil from Iran. So what happened during November 16th and 23rd, it was basically stemming from a resurgence of public economic hardship due to these sanctions. And it was increasingly isolating the economy. And this basically incentivized the government to fervently pursue strengthening and expanding the National Information Network. And finally, what was the inflection point in itself was when they decided to implement a 50% price hike of fuel domestically. The public was just basically at their wits' end. So not only was it a 50% hike, it was also a rationing. So it basically instigated mass protests throughout the country. And what we saw in this instance is that the NIN was much stronger. And to regain control, the Supreme National Security Council, they ordered an internet blackout, and which basically left a near total shutdown. The only thing that remained open were top government authorities who had internet access, because again, they were learning from the previous instance. This shutdown lasted for about 7 days, with global connectivity levels plummeting to about 4 to 5%. And this further funneled internet users to basically forcefully use the now operational National Information Network. We also saw that internet on mobile carriers wasn't really restored until the 27th, so much later than this 7-day period. This shutdown provided the opportunity for authorities to conceal the scale of violence used against protesters, with about, I think the last number I saw, it was a little bit more than 300 that were estimated to be killed. And they used these protests as a testing ground for the National Information Network, only revealed its clumsiness and faults, because the intranet only policy basically further degraded the economy, because in that 7 days, they lost an approximate $1.5 billion, which is a lot of money in Iran. And their biggest blunder, which is a little bit comical, is that they forgot that they needed international DNS, and they didn't have an internal search engine. So people, even if they wanted to use the NIN network, they couldn't find any in-country services because Google search was not available. It was blocked. And they didn't have any other internal search engine. So no one knew where to go just to find basic services. Basic services including things like medical or just local government services even. This brings us to what they've learned in 2025, which is the most sophisticated response that we have seen thus far. And it was just last month. So basically, on June 13th, Israel initiated a large-scale attack against Iran, which targeted nuclear facilities and military installations. And Iran retaliated, and then the US gets involved. Ceasefire was declared on June 24th, but we kind of feel like on our end, we're still waiting to see what happens. We still feel like that whatever's going on, we don't know if the government is going to impose even more severe shutdowns like before, or what's going to happen. So basically, since 2019, the government imposed the most severe shutdown, dropping traffic levels by approximately 97%. We saw this during the 18th and the 21st of June, affecting major mobile networks and near total disruption of international traffic. The government attributed shutdowns to cybersecurity concerns and was protecting itself, in theory, from hackers, external hackers. this plunging of the internet to a digital blackout, it allowed the government to basically limit the information internally and externally. It became its main source of protecting its PR in front of its own civilians and from organizing and mobilizing the civilians during this conflict. Even though that now the connectivity is relatively restored to pre-shutdown levels, we do see that there are some very interesting filtering patterns that are starting to emerge. Sorry, it's not working on my end. Give me 1 second. Sorry, I'm not sure what happened. It didn't click over.
We can see your slides and we can still hear you.
Sure.
Oh,
it went back. Yeah. Sorry, 1 second. Now it caught up. It caught up. So the next few slides, we're just going to show you visually what we saw on our end for June 2025. As previously mentioned, these are sort of the targets that occurred during the surprise attack, I guess, on June 13th. And it was pretty large scale. It was mainly on nuclear sites as well as military sites. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay.
The slides did advance, yeah.
Okay, good. Thank you. Just wanted to make sure. This slide, we like this slide a lot. We decided to give you sort of a wide range between June 10th and 30th of what we see on Cloudflare. So previous to the 18th, June 18th, you can see that it's basically like normal activity. The HTTP requests are normal and the total bytes are sort of at a normal level. And then when you have the attacks on June 13th, you start seeing them sort of go down, and then they just drop off on the 18th. And it pretty much, the total shutdown lasts until about the 21st of June. And just a little bit before, between the 13th and the 18th, you can see that the HTTP requests are going through the roof, and the total bytes are not matching those requests. After the 21st, you can see that connectivity is partially restored. And from June 25th, it goes back to more or less normal levels. This next slide is from IOTA. And for those of you that don't know, IOTA is a group from Georgia Tech University in the US, and they basically their focus is measuring and detecting internet outages worldwide in real time. And users rely on IOTA open data as a source to track, monitor internet connectivity, as well as technical research for the community. We see, just for comparative, just for sake of comparison, during June 18th to the 21st, we also see the same full shutdown. And what IOTA does is that they measure BGP with active probing and with Google data, which more or less shows the general activity in the same time frame as the Cloudflare slide just previously. We're going to take a closer look at the BGP analysis of the shutdown in the next slides. All right, so this is an internet map of Iran, and this is basically taking a snapshot of what we saw in terms of BGP data on the first day of Israel's attack on June 13th specifically. So this shutdown, what we can see, has a much less effect on BGP sessions. So on the right-hand side, I think, yeah, it should be a right-hand. On the right-hand side, you have the telecommunication infrastructure company. And that gateway is very autonomous. And you can see upstream to the Iranian network on June 13th, the first day of the attacks, this BGP connectivity is more or less did not change throughout this time period. And you can also see how centralized it has become. On the left-hand side is the 2019 incident, which happened between November 15th and the 25th. And you can see that in 2019, they did the shutdown using the BGP method by unplugging the IP prefixes out of BGP announcements. And when you compare that to what happened in 2025, it's been much less impacted because they implemented not only by using BGP, but by using censorship middle boxes that were placed in the network. This is just sort of a wider visualized map of BGP data, specifically on June 13th. And you can see that the left is the international stream, and the big red band in the middle is the telecommunication infrastructure company. And it looks like a single network, basically connecting Iran to the national network. And then towards the right, you have the smaller in-country networks in Iran. So the shutdown implementation, the methodology that they used for last month in June, you can basically see that the NIN is reaching maturity. It means now that shutdowns can be implemented with minimal collateral damage to domestic connectivity. And by not using BGP to unplug connectivity, they are now using censorship middle boxes to basically just drop connections. The ease of implementing these are basically allows them to implement with more frequency the shutdowns, and also it monetarily also doesn't cost businesses that much anymore as well. And the loss of international connectivity could, when you have the ability to do this more often and with such ease as they do now, the human rights implications just kind of skyrocket. And that is our biggest concern at the moment. For like the human rights implications for Iran, they continue to remain the same, but we just see them as being skyrocketing in the near future. And this really focuses on restrictions of freedom of expression and access to information. It's hindering the freedom of assembly and association. It's also hindering the ability of people to document human rights violations. So really targeting journalists and human rights defenders. And also the disruption of essential services, as I mentioned before, which these shutdowns can really harm access to things like healthcare, emergency services, online education, financial services, and these impact the daily life of all citizens. Even more so in Iran, you see the targeting of vulnerable groups now that they have been able to fine-tune the NIN network and also censorship. And they are also increasing surveillance and censorship on everybody overall. Sorry, I think I have reached my time, so I'll stop here and the end of the slides.
Thanks a lot, Shabnam. We have open queue, so we have 6 minutes or so for questions. Folks want to come to the mic, please raise your hand in the client tool. You're welcome also online if you're joining virtually to get in the queue. Go ahead, Nick.
Yeah, thank you so much. That is such useful research. Sorry, I'm hearing some typing in the background. I was especially curious about your one of your last comments there about novel filtering techniques. It sounds like the trend that I'm seeing here is away from like sophisticated endpoint specific censorship, right? They're not stopping people from reaching certain newspapers or certain external sources. They're just able to cut off all international connectivity altogether, which we think of as introducing a lot of collateral damage, but maybe that's just only international collateral damage. Do you see increased sophistication in, or when you're talking about novel filtering, do you see increased sophistication in targeting certain types of connections or connections to particular endpoints or connections by particular people? Or is the sophistication just in the ability of cutting off all international traffic while retaining internal traffic?
No, they basically drop all connections to international destinations. So that's basically the focus right now. And when you want to sort of implement and run your country on an intranet, that's basically what they mean. And for us in our world, that's an overall internet shutdown when you don't have any access to external sites. They're also whitelisting international APIs and required systems to function domestic websites, including that as well. Nick, am I answering your question correctly?
Yeah, absolutely. So they're whitelisting
Okay.
particular international destinations?
Yeah, they're whitelisting international APIs. So one thing
Are there good
to mention.
examples of that? That's interesting.
Off the top of my head, examples. Like Google Web Search, right? Because there is no internal search function. They have not yet created a national information network search engine for themselves. So they do whitelist Google Search. And what ends up happening is that if you do click on something that's outside of what is allowed on NIN, then they just don't allow you to get there. It just drops your connection. But their internal services and everything that is allowed on the NIN network will show up on Google Search.
That's really interesting. Thank you.
Google Maps is also allowed. Sorry which is also, I guess, maybe a good thing.
Nick Sullivan, go ahead.
Hi, this is just a short announcement. We are going to be launching a new mailing list for IETF mailing list called Armor, which is going to be focused on discussions as to how to make protocols more resilient against tampering, intentional or otherwise, in hostile environments. This overlaps a lot with what happens in this group, so keep your eyes open for an email to the HRPC group, and anybody who wants to participate in the discussion is welcome to.
It's a super exciting thing. We can certainly talk more about that in AOB if folks want to, but yeah, thank you for making that announcement. I don't see anybody else in the queue. So Chantal, do you want to come up and I'll get your slides going and give you the clicker. Thank you, Shabnam. Really appreciate your presentation and all the work that you are doing at INITA.
Thank you for having us.
All right, you're all set up.
Thank you. Hi, everyone. It's nice to meet you. It's my first IETF. So it's it's great to be able to speak to you and start this discussion, which I think follows nicely from the last presentation about internet shutdowns in conflicts. I'm going to talk to you a bit about sort of general international law considerations as applicable to ICT activities during armed conflict, where sort of the discussions are the main discussions in legal circles, and I will focus primarily on international humanitarian law, so also provide a bit of an overview of the discussions that we're following there, how freedom of expression in armed conflicts is specifically threatened through sort of the increased migration of wars into the digital space, as well as briefly touch upon the sort of the responsibilities of private entities. So yeah, as I mentioned, warfare is becoming increasingly digital. Very often, sort of physical force, kinetic force is accompanied or supported or made possible through non-kinetic or cyber means. We witness increasingly cyber attacks during armed conflicts. You have examples from Yemen, Ukraine, Iran, but really almost every conflict now will also, I mean, every conflict, cyber attacks will be happening. We have increasingly private military security companies who also offer these sort of cyber security services and cyber surveillance software as part of the package that they offer to conflict parties. One of the signs that this is really becoming increasingly a very prominent issue is that the Office of the Prosecutor of the International Criminal Court is currently working on a policy to sort of set out how the office is understanding how cyber activities or cyber-enabled activities could amount to international crimes. So the crime of genocide, crimes against humanity, or war crimes, or the crime of aggression. So this is really something that sort of the conflict actors or institutions that have to grapple with armed conflict contexts or contexts where atrocity crimes proliferate have increasingly had to grapple with. In terms of, as Article 19, we're a freedom of expression organization. Probably some of you are familiar with us. We focus specifically also on what this means in terms of increased threats to freedom of expression. Some of the examples are on the slide. So it ranges from online disinformation campaigns in Sudan to internet shutdowns in the DRC, Ukraine's request to ICANN to cut off certain Russian domains, spyware uses, also increasingly surveillance technology that is used to make also targeting decisions. So a collection of an increasing amount of data to then be able to decide who is a civilian and who is a combatant and who can be targeted. We'll get to that a little bit later. So here again, it's really pervasive. It really raises increasing concerns. And that's why, as Article 19, we've also increasingly worked on freedom of expression in armed conflicts at the legal level. One thing that we need to also keep emphasizing is that sometimes there is the perception that freedom of expression is sort of, you know, in the face of mass displacement, starvation, mass killings, is a sort of should be of secondary nature. Or it's mainly about organizing a protest, political dissent, things which are obviously increasingly incredibly important. But what we always need to emphasize is that now that civilians are so dependent on everything they do, really, and hospitals and humanitarian organizations are so dependent on internet infrastructure, it's really sort of a lifeline and the fundamental necessity to be able to share and receive information. So it might help civilians from preventing zones of active fighting. Again, being able to access humanitarian relief, families can stay connected and get informed about where their loved ones are. Hospitals and humanitarian organizations need internet access to remain connected and functional. And of course, there is the element of journalists needing the right to freedom of expression and to be free from surveillance, to be able to report from the ground what's happening. And of course, that will also support eventual accountability efforts. So we really have to emphasize and keep emphasizing that this is a fundamental right that continues to apply during armed conflict and that cannot be sort of neglected in the face of other rights. As I mentioned, you will, obviously this group talks about human rights considerations in protocols. What I want to do is add an additional layer of complexity and sort of see how international humanitarian law as a separate but sort of closely linked legal framework, what the sort of main discussions are that might also be of interest to this group. First of all, a couple of basics. So international humanitarian law are the rules of norms that apply in armed conflict. And it's important to remember that they apply alongside human rights. So any sort of human rights considerations that this group looks at when developing protocols, those remain relevant and, if anything, even more salient and important for people affected by armed conflicts. What it does, humanitarian law is focused on restricting the means and methods of warfare. So, for example, prohibiting certain types of weapons or prohibiting certain ways of conducting a war, like intentionally terrorizing the civilian population. And it protects persons who are not or who are no longer participating in hostilities, for example, prisoners of war or civilians. And what it does overall, it seeks to strike a balance. I mean, it operates in the acceptance that armed conflicts exist and will continue to exist, but even wars have rules, and that there is a minimum standards that everyone and every conflict party needs to abide by, whether they claim that they're acting in self-defense or not, whether the war is a just or an unjust one. There is a certain basic level of sort of decency and humanity that always needs to be upheld. And some of the core international humanitarian law treaties are the Geneva Conventions of 1949 and the additional protocols of 1977. Why is it important? Because a bit like with human rights, those rules were adopted primarily a few decades ago. So there are now questions how they can still remain relevant in the face of, again, increased sort of warfare and conduct of hostilities that effectively takes place in cyberspace. A couple of key international humanitarian law principles, and I want to also again talk a little bit about the discussions that are happening as to how they can remain relevant in cyberspace, or how they can apply to ICT activities. As mentioned, sort of the first two principles, humanity and military necessity, are really the two sort of foundational principles that cut through the whole humanitarian legal framework, and that is sort of specified more in the specific rules, which might, for example, allow the use of force against soldiers, for example, but they will not allow torturing soldiers or inflicting unnecessary suffering. And those two sort of basic principles get concretized a bit more in the principles on the conduct of hostilities. The first one is the principle of distinction, which says that conflict parties must at all times distinguish between combatants and civilians as they conduct their military operations, and also between military objectives and civilian objects. The second principle is the principle of proportionality, which says that even if you target a military objective and that might lead also to injury or harm to civilian, said injury, said incidental harm to civilian cannot exceed the sort of definite military advantage that you anticipate as you launch an attack. And then the principle of precaution is really linked to those two, which states that conflict parties must take steps and sort of take constant care to try to avoid civilian harm. Now, for example, if we apply this to an internet shutdown, we've been talking about internet shutdowns in Iran, one of them being in conflict settings, again, perhaps as claimed, it was mainly for defensive purposes, but the reality is that we see an increasing rise of internet shutdowns in almost all armed conflicts, and that conflict parties use this very often alongside, for example, military operations to be able to conceal what the armed forces are doing, to be able to restrict reporting from the ground, or even sort of impacted communities to share online what's happening. So we have a number of rules, they are not on the slide, but that do, in humanitarian law, that do offer protections from internet shutdowns. For example, the obligation to respect humanitarian law. That means that conflict parties, again, if they intentionally impose a shutdown, that will be sort of designed to conceal and facilitate humanitarian law violations, such as, again, torture or indiscriminate attacks against civilians, that will be a violation of humanitarian law. Also, there are special protections of hospitals or humanitarian organization, which again, if the internet is shut down or their infrastructure, internet infrastructure is attacked specifically, might not be able to operate properly. And again, that might be a violation of international humanitarian law. One of the very sort of important rules that I mentioned is this principle of distinction and proportionality, which sort of the most specific prohibitions around that are linked to this notion of attack. And there have been a lot of discussions amongst legal circles as to what is attack. And given that sort of when this, the notion of attack was initially conceptualized, we were all thinking about physical injury more. So physical harm to civilian objects. And the prohibition of not targeting civilians and the prohibition not to cause sort of excessive injury to civilians was also linked more to that physical notion of violence. This can today then lead to the sort of absurd conclusion that, for example, destroying a civilian iPhone would be prohibited by the rules governing attack, whilst, for example, a cyber attack on a network that does not have immediate physical consequences would not be as limited under the rules of humanitarian law. And to avoid that, there have been lots of questions around should sort of loss of functionality of an object, sort of a loss of functionality of a service also be considered as a sort of injury. Should a psychological injury be also included in the discussion, in the notion and the definition of attack, to be able to find sort of proxies to this notion of physical violence that was so central to the discussions a few decades ago, but is in a sense outdated. A second discussion is also can data alone qualify as an object? So if we have, say, malware that tampers with data or data is deleted, should that be prohibited by humanitarian law rules, because that can be considered a civilian object that should not be attacked, basically. And one of the also problematic issues or the challenges that the sort of humanitarian law community also faces is the fact, as you will know, infrastructure is often used both by civilians but also by the military. So the military might use the same internet to communicate as civilians use to call the hospital and to stay connected or to report what's happening. So then that means that the principle of distinction can perhaps offer less protection, because there is an arguable case to say, well, if we attack the internet infrastructure and it is used by the military, that means I can gain a military advantage. And this is where the proportionality discussion becomes much more important, to say, okay, but if the impact on civilians is so strong, then it should still be limited by the rules of humanitarian law. The reality is, though, that those proportionality assessments, it's not mathematical science. It's sometimes difficult to predict what are the knock-on effects of say, an internet shutdown. So there are lots of discussions again happening there to see how can we ensure that the humanitarian laws do not become sort of too permissive because they're not adequately applied to cyberspace. And linked to that, I want to also speak about the role of tech companies, which have increasingly become key actors in conflict just because they are providing the infrastructure and the capabilities, again, to sort of carry out these non-kinetic operations in armed conflict. For example, one thing is obviously the big impact that social media companies might have on even what sort of content or what sort of documentation of conflicts is available. And in particular, in very restrictive information environments where journalists don't have access, journalists get killed, media gets banned, that reporting that is that content that can be shared on social media becomes more and more important. We have the example of Telenor, who left Myanmar. The junta in Myanmar asked Telenor to shut down the internet, to install surveillance capabilities, to give them access to user data. So that also, the reality is that can put a company, in particular if they're not well prepared, it can put them in a very tricky situation where complying with government requests makes them complicit to human rights violations, but leaving the country and potentially, selling to a company that is even less inclined to follow human rights standards can also put users at increased risk. In Israel, Palestine, also we've seen WhatsApp has been allegedly used data from WhatsApp to target Palestinians through the Lavender AI system. Another story, Google is worried that it can't really control how Israel uses the Project Nimbus. And we've heard earlier, with these huge tech companies that sort of almost control everything across the internet, that problem also materializes in conflicts, where you basically can have a tech giant which provides services for the International Criminal Court, which provides services for humanitarian organization, and provides services for a conflict party that is accused of atrocity crimes. So obviously the conflict of interest is all over the place. And that problem, if anything, manifests in even more dramatic ways in those contexts. Just probably you've heard of them, a reminder that private entities, of course, are not held to the same human rights obligations and humanitarian law obligations as states, who are sort of the primary duty bearers. In humanitarian law, non-state actors or non-state armed groups are also very, very important actor. But when we engage with companies or when we call them out for their failures, we do always say that they do have at least a responsibility to minimize, to assess, identify and mitigate any potential negative impact their services could have on human rights and humanitarian law. And in conflict contexts, that means basically making a bigger effort to understand their impact on conflict dynamics, to understand who the main actors are and how providing them with services could lead to harm to civilians or human rights. And also important, again, maybe something of interest in the Telenor Myanmar case, that those responsibilities of the companies operate independently of whether the state itself is willing or able to comply with its human rights obligation or its humanitarian law obligation. So you can't say, the government has asked me to access user data, or the government has asked me to shut down the internet. Of course, that will, practically speaking, be a very important consideration, because sometimes we've had discussions with ISPs where they also say, well, if the non-state armed group is in our offices with the Kalashnikovs, that is a very convincing argument to just do as they say. So of course the realities are very complex, but private entities need to do their own assessment and need to do everything they can to, again, mitigate any risks in becoming complicit in human rights and humanitarian law violations. I will stop here, perhaps for those who are interested in this, and maybe some of you are aware that tomorrow there is the working group at the same time, the DM working group, where upon initiative of the International Committee of the Red Cross, they are developing a sort of digital emblem for cyberspace to mirror the Red Cross emblems that have this protective that has this protective function for certain medical institutions and humanitarian organizations, and to be able to translate that into cyberspace. And their humanitarian law understanding is also very important to ensure that sort of the standard is developed properly for the digital emblem. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Chantal. Yes, and thanks for the plug for DM. So you can look in your agenda, but it's happening effectively at the same time tomorrow. Any questions? We have plenty of time. Folks can get into the queue, both online and in the room. Great. Well, thanks again, Chantal. We really appreciate your insights. It's one of the things that I think HRPC can provide is sometimes a sort of deeper dive into the non-technical, but still extremely detail-oriented and framework-focused aspects of some of these problems and solutions that come to the IETF and IRTF. Okay, so with that, I think I'm handing it over to you, Sophia, because you're going to give an update on our working documents. So go ahead.
So this is just going to be, hello. So this is just going to be a really quick update because we have been working on this draft for a while. And just for context, specifically the draft that we're talking about is the Intimate Partner Violence Digital Considerations draft, which started as a research group, as a research group item some years ago. And a lot of people have actually provided comments and feedback on the mailing list. So at the moment, we have a very kind of like polished and that addresses all of the feedback and comments version of the draft, which is expired, but will be updated soon. And essentially what we are aiming to is actually send a new non-expired version of the draft, maybe just wait some 2 weeks to receive any comments, if there are any that is outstanding or that people have not provided. And with that, we will actually try to call to see if we do the last call. So if you're interested or you have something that you see in the draft that has not been addressed and really needs to be addressed, this is really your weeks that we actually want to receive that kind of feedback. So please engage if you're interested and if you have any concerns about it. And with that, we'll probably do last call.
But any questions on that now? It's been on the agenda, so if you came with... We put this on the agenda in case folks wanted to come with any feedback. So we can also have that discussion now if there are any comments. Nick, you're in the queue. Go ahead.
Yeah, thanks for the update. I haven't read the draft recently, but I will when you send out that new call. I just wanted to ask now, though, the adult working group on location trackers has been working on a document about specific scenarios for gender-based violence and how people might be tracked in that way. I think I've suggested that they look at this draft, but I also wondered if maybe you could look at it the other way and see, is there anything they're sort of missing in that type of document that, hey, we could have had as general advice, or anything they're bringing up that, hey, we could be making more general to intimate partner violence considerations.
That's an awesome suggestion. I think what you were saying is like like the HRPC could also review the doc that you're referencing that's happening in DOLT. Maybe we can definitely capture that in the notes from today. And if anybody participates in both groups would want to take the initiative to give HRPC mailing list a heads up about that doc with a link, that would also be great. And CCing the DOLT working group so that any responses to that with review feedback would go to both groups. That would be really smart. Great. Any other, I don't see anyone else in the queue.
So the second point of Nick, I think it was something that has been discussed in the mailing list as well. If the draft has to be more general, not specifically to the case of intimate partner violence, but rather on the cases of other kinds of like surveillance via coercion. And one of the decisions was to create separate drafts for that. We haven't picked that work, but at least for me, what I plan to do is finish this draft and then pick up the other work, because if not, at least myself, I drive myself insane with too much work.
Okay, great.
Fair, thank you.
Yeah, I mean, also, you know, our work tends to be more people focused, so it actually makes sense to elaborate a use case that is narrow to the community and instead of the technology. So I think that was the rough TLDR on the decision about different drafts. Other comments, actually, any other business? One of the AOB that I knew we had actually on the agenda was what Nick Sullivan said before, actually what really well timed following the presentation by Shabnam to talk about a new IRSG or IRTF mailing list on censorship. And I think that squarely fits within what HRPC has worked on for a long time. Folks might remember there might have been some months or years actually at that point that where the what's now RFC 9505, the censorship techniques draft or worldwide censorship survey was talked about in HRPC. Ultimately, it was RFC'd via the privacy research group. But I do think that as we've probably even talked about in these working group meetings or research group meetings in the past, research groups like Global Access to the Internet for All, Measuring the Internet Research Group, Privacy Research Group, HRPC, all are sort of implicated in any kind of work that discusses censorship. And so hopefully folks, once Nick sends that email to the list, folks from HRPC can feel free to subscribe, and we can formulate a sort of plan of action for how this work moves through the IRTF and through the IETF. Any other AOB or questions on that point? Wonderful. Well, I think that means that we are effectively done. Yes? Okay, good. Well, I mean, it is, you know, it's quite late, I think, for work now. It's nearly 7 p.m. in Madrid. So thank you all for your time today. Thank you for coming to the research group meeting at IETF 123 Madrid. And thanks so much to the folks that joined online. I hope you have a really good IETF week. And yeah, see you online and on the list. Thank you.